This lecture is on quite a different topic from the earlier one today. It comes in part out of my thinking about the intelligent design debate, which, although intelligent design has been primarily a North American phenomenon, I think it raises broad questions that are important for the relationship and conversation between religion and science, and especially between theology and evolution in any culture today. Broadly speaking, I'm going to be going over 6 models of divine action with respect to the natural sciences, and discussing each one of them and arguing for the proposal I find most adequate, which is a macro design theory within a scientific worldview. And if you have the handout, I've given you some of the slides, maybe some of the more overview ones for you to look at. And I've also handed out a copy of an article that I wrote for the new Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the 2nd edition, on religion and the physical sciences. But in that, I used the concept of macro design a few times to talk about that also. And it's the publication where I've discussed in print the most this idea. So in part, we have to begin by discussing what we mean by design or purpose. And as a theologian, I need to emphasize that by design in this talk, I mean something different than they mean it in biology or engineering. For here in design and theology, we're really asking the question, what is God up to in creation? What's the purpose? What purposes is God up to in creation? And it's true that the design of the universe is going to have some kind of empirical quality, but sometimes in biology, people say, things happen without any particular teleology, without any particular purpose. But when you ask the question of an evolutionary biologist, what do you mean by purpose, design, telos, teleology, you get a lot of different answers. The one I've found most in the literature is something like, you couldn't predict the structure of the organism given the initial conditions and the knowledge we have of natural sciences. So to say something has a purpose or a telos or a teleology in biology is very different than what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about being able to predict the structure of an organism and its ecological niche, just given the initial conditions and the laws and principles of nature and whatever understanding of biology and evolution we may have. Rather, I'm talking about design in terms of that come out of the intelligent design debate, but that are really about questions of the structure and order of the whole universe, understood, again, spiritually, theologically, having to do with our relationship with God or the religious ultimate as we understand it. So the questions raised by the intelligent design movement, I think, are important questions that we should take seriously. And I do take seriously the more theoretical and academic side of that movement, although I recognize that in American culture and politics, what's important are the popularizing things that get down to the level of high schools and boards of education and so forth. But mostly what I am going to talk about are the theorists. And I'd like to propose a way forward in this debate between supposedly chance, evolution that is unguided, on the one hand, which is the way many interpreters, including Dawkins, but also Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, would argue, and the sort of intelligent design view which says that there are particular things in the universe, life, DNA molecules, which are specially designed by a supernatural being or some super intelligent being. That's the origin of life on Earth. So these questions come out of biological evolution. And there's lots of theories of evolution. I mean, as a theologian, I know that most people accept some kind of Darwinian synthesis. But if you look at the history of the idea of biological evolution, you have Lamarck, you have all these other theories. So there's lots of theories of biological evolution. So I want to first talk about broadly the whole idea of modification with descent, and from simple organisms to more complex ones over long periods of time, and call that biological evolution. Okay, so Darwinism then is just one version of it, one very popular and probably right version, but still just one version. If we accept these broadly, though, very broadly, include all these different historical theories that are now sometimes passed over by scientists, what are the theological consequences? How shall we understand God's work in creation? And here I think the key question has to do, once again, just as we saw earlier, with the interpretation of the data. Not with the raw data itself, but with theories that explain the data and interpretive schemes that explain the theories. And it seems to me that we have two broad, again this is a very big brush statement. On the one hand, we have those who think of evolution as a purely random, purposeless activity, and others who say it's designed. Well, which is it? Maybe those two propositions are contradictory, and so you have to take one or the other, or they could both be false. But I think my answer is going to be that it's a bit of both. That depending on how you mean these terms, there's going to be randomness, openness, self-organizing development in the universe, and there's also going to be purpose. Well, let's first look at the question of what God does by something that's basic between all the great monotheistic faiths, whether from India or the Middle East. That is, the God of monotheistic religions. And in this view, the basic thing that people hold in common is that God is creator and sustainer of all reality. So not only does God create the universe out of nothing in the beginning, but God always creates the universe out of nothing. If God were to cease putting forth God's own energies, the universe would fall back into that nothingness from which it came. And we call that the idea that God sustains the universe moment by moment in its being. So without God, there would be no being, there would be no laws of nature, there would be no energy, there would be no structure, there would be nothing. So not only does God create out of nothing, but there's a continuing creation in which God sustains the laws and principles of nature, as well as all things that are in being and becoming everywhere. Even if there's a multiverse with a cosmos filled with all these multiple universes, God still sustains all of those, and whatever laws are true that allowed the multiverse to exist in the first place. And when we talk about a purpose, we're talking about God guiding all of reality towards some larger purpose, but I'm not committed to the idea, at least I'm toying with it, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that believing that at the theological level means there has to be a specific empirical result. Maybe there is. You know, maybe the fine-tuning character of the universe that allows for life is an empirical result. But I'm not convinced that it's necessary that this spiritual truth have an empirical result that we can test in natural science. It's probably going to have some discernible results so we can know it's true, but that's something different from being able to test empirically in natural science. So our big questions here then have to do with God, design, the universe, and evolution. Does God act in special or unique ways? What empirical evidence do we have of God's activities in nature? What exactly is the relationship between God's action and the laws and principles of nature? And then, I don't actually like to use the word miracle because it's a loaded word, a very loaded word. It muddies the water. But we can talk about, does God do extraordinary acts or strictly extraordinary acts that are special divine actions? That is, does God act in ways beyond creating and sustaining the universe in special, unique, particular ways that the sciences can neither explain nor predict? That's what I mean by an extraordinary act or a strictly extraordinary act. Well, that's a lot to cover in just a few minutes, but we'll make a stab at it by looking at some of the different models of divine action that exist today in this literature of religion and science. And one is, I will call neo-deism. One of the people I know, David Griffin, calls this the no miracles rule. And of course, he doesn't really mean there's no miracles, because, you know, like I said, the word miracles is loaded and muddy and it screws everything up when you use it. But what he means is God does no special, unique, divine, extraordinary acts that, in principle, could neither be explained nor predicted by the natural sciences. The actual word he uses is violate the laws of nature. I think that gives the laws of nature a little more power than they in fact have. I don't think you can violate them or not violate them. That's a question of the right metaphor there. But anyway, in neo-deism, there's this so-called no miracles rule. God doesn't do strictly extraordinary events in nature. There's something called a top-down or inside-out, outside-in causation. There's bottom-up causation, preferred by our friend Professor Polkinghorne. There's a view that's not as commonly known, I think especially in Europe. But it's a neo-Thomistic understanding of God's action in the world. When it comes to intelligent design, in this categorization, this simplified heuristic category, I call that a micro-design approach. And I think the reason for that will be obvious in a little bit. And then my own proposal is for a macro-design approach within a scientific worldview. That is, the macro design is a religious hypothesis that then is a presupposition for a scientific worldview. Well, let's look at these in order. I could have looked at them out of order, but I thought that would be even more confusing than talk would otherwise be. That was supposed to be funny, I guess it wasn't. God only does one big thing forever, according to these neo-deist interpretations like David Griffin. But on the other hand, if God only does one thing and does nothing specific, nothing unique, nothing different, it's hard to see how we can know God on this basis, because God is going to need to interact with creatures. And I'm firmly convinced that every mental state has a brain state correlate, at least for humans. So how can God interact spiritually, psychologically, in any kind of revelation with humans if God cannot alter the normal course of natural events in any way whatsoever that's unique to a certain situation? For example, another American example is Gordon Kaufman. He's mostly written theology books, but he's written a little bit in religion and science. And his ultimate spiritual reality is creativity. But the interesting thing about that, if you read his books on creativity and the spiritual reality, the great mystery, as he calls it, everything he says is compatible with believing there is no God. It's perfectly compatible with atheism. And I think the reason for that is, if as he does, you see God as the God, the mystery that's at the boundaries of our questions, that's beyond our understanding, that's the source of creativity and life, and you then it's hard to see why you would be a monotheist. I mean, it's compatible with all kinds of different perspectives. There has been, in the past, a religion based solely on reason. At least it was supposed to be based on reason and on nature. Thomas Paine wrote The Age of Reason. He was an American Enlightenment figure and a deist. Many of the leaders of the American Revolution were deists. Although the origin of deism lies in the English Reformation. But I don't find this tradition of theology has been very fruitful. I think it was a dead end. Then it proved itself to be a program of inquiry that ran into far too many problems. And I don't really see why we should go back to some kind of theistic perspective. And certainly I would argue that science does not require a theology like this. There's nothing in the natural and social sciences that says God never does any specific. I mean, because these sciences tell us nothing about God, they study molecules or living organisms or human societies or the human psyche. I don't think they can make pronouncements about what God does or doesn't do. There may be some problem with the word intervention, though, I think. But there, for me, the problem has to do with the very idea of intervention. It's a conception of God who's basically outside the system, most of the time not there, absent from the world, and then every once in a while God sticks in a little finger into the universe and pulls a magic trick. I mean, the word intervention suggests a bad theology, is what I'm suggesting. I prefer to talk about God altering the process of nature because God's always there to do so. Okay, strictly story made. Then top-down causation is generally associated with Arthur Peacock. And this is the top-down causation or outward-in causation is, again, God acting within creation only by acting on the whole web or system of reality in a way that, and here's that unfortunate metaphor again, does not violate the laws of nature. One example of outside-in or top-down causation is the blowhole of the whale. Okay, whales were land mammals. You know, in fact, we have discovered now an almost complete system of fossils, including 27 intermediate forms for the whale, from primitive mammal that had legs and swam around in the sea to the modern whale. It's one of the great examples of the myth that we don't have examples of intermediate species in the fossil record. That's just not true. And the whale's a good example of that. But notice how, you know, the blowhole was originally a nose on a mammal, kind of like our nose. How did it get way up at the top? Well, that was the operation, right, of the sea itself. And all the laws of hydrodynamics and everything having to do with the fact that they have to go up and breathe, so that eventually the nostril moved up to the top of the whale's head. That's an example of outside in. You see the whole system of the ecology acted on the species in such a way that over time the nose moved to the top of the head. That's an example of top-down or outside-in causation. You act on the individual by acting on the entire system that the individual organism lives in. I actually don't have a problem with this. I think that unlike the neo-deist model, I do think that God probably does act in this way. So my only problem as a theologian or a philosopher of religion is, does this account for everything that most of the religions want to say that God does? Just for an example, let's say God sustains the laws of nature moment by moment. That is a way of acting on the whole system, right? So that could be understood as a kind of top-down causation. So I don't have any problem with this as a model, but the problem I have with Peacock is he thought it was the model. In other words, this is the right way to think about how God acts on the world. Then with John Polkinghorne, we get a different understanding in which we might call bottom-up causation. And here we see God as acting within the dynamic and chaotic systems, that is, within the indeterminacy of modern physics that we associate with quantum mechanics and chaos theory. And once again, what's important to Polkinghorne is God does not trespass on the laws of nature or undermine God's own actions in sustaining and creating these laws and principles. And Polkinghorne says that God who acted in such a capricious way would be God acting against God. So, because, you know, he sees God rightly as a sustainer of the laws and principles. Why would God break God's own laws? It doesn't make sense. And I think here the same problem is, not that God doesn't act in this way, because I think God very may well act in this way, but whether this is enough to satisfy our religious worldviews. And I've always thought that particularly myself, even reading some of Polkinghorne's early books. And I'm happy to say that in the 21st century, Polkinghorne has come to think that it is not now enough. That relative to some of the promises of the biblical God about the redemption of all creation, this kind of activity, which perfectly legitimate model, not saying that God doesn't act this way, but that it's not enough. We need somehow more. So how much is enough? That's always a good question when you're eating chocolate or thinking about philosophy. I want to suggest that, at least from the Abrahamic religious tradition of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, that we're going to need some special divine actions to explain some of the key core doctrines of religious faith. Although I'm trying to avoid the word miracle, it sometimes is impossible, but if we think about events in the physical world that are beyond the powers of nature, and that therefore go beyond both top-down and bottom-up causation, we then get to the question, does theology need such events? I think they do. For example, creation out of nothing is going to be, it turns out, an event like this. To create the universe out of nothing requires an act of divine omnipotence that goes beyond what the laws of nature can allow. In fact, it makes the laws of nature be what they are. So such an event has to be beyond the laws of nature. If we think there are any natural miracles, or that is, any strictly extraordinary events done by God, which are signs of God's grace that's always present, or I actually prefer the term reign and realm of God, or kingdom of God that's always present, then we're going to need God to do some special divine acts that are strictly extraordinary. And finally, if we think that, we look at what the natural sciences are telling us about the long future of the physical world, it doesn't look good for the long-term history of our cosmos. Eventually, everything that exists will perish in some kind of a heat death or a cold death, or depending on your model and which theory you accept. So in order to renew all creation beyond the end of the physical universe, I put end in quotes there because there's more than one possible theory of how it might end. But I would count the infinite, ceaseless drifting apart of dead particles where entropy is maximized as a kind of an end myself. God is going to have to do some things that go beyond the capacities of nature to bring about. So, I think we need a little bit more. Oops, sorry, I should have kept up with myself on that. Now, let's look at Neo-Thomism, because I think there might be some help there. So this view is associated with those influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas. One example in the world of physics, by the way, someone I admire, is William Stager. He's really a very brilliant physicist and a Jesuit. And I think he's also a Roman Catholic. But his work is extraordinary. But he's very much in this tradition if you read some of his papers and essays. The idea is that God is the uncreated ultimate cause, in Latin, the causa prima. And that everything else in the universe is contingent but genuine cause, a secondary cause, or I prefer created cause. So you and I are all created causes. The earth is a created cause whose gravity is pulling us down toward the earth and so forth. But all these things exist and continue to exist and have the operations they do only because they're held in being and willed to have those powers by the primary cause. The interesting thing about this, of course, is that you can say the empirical science study created causes. They don't study the first cause. That's philosophy and theology does that. So normally, regularly, God acts with and through created causes, secondary causes. Although in the Middle Ages, and certainly Aquinas thought that God sometimes acts by pure omnipotence. And the example is usually the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I mean, that's something that a dead body doesn't on its own however much you want to cooperate with the divine, come back to life after being dead for 3 days. So that's going to require God's omnipotent power. What this allowed, though, was a view of scientific macro design, which funded science, but didn't put God into the scientific world. So one of the examples I have of that is a quotation on the handout from Jean Buridan. Jean Buridan was one of the great medieval natural philosophers. Natural philosophy is what they called natural science back then. And his argument was that natural philosophy should proceed as if God did not act. In other words, he did not believe that natural philosophy, because it studies secondary causes, should sort of appeal to a kind of God from the sky fixing scientific problems. I mean, let's investigate things according to their natural properties and see if we can't learn about that. I mean, and of course his discipline was natural philosophy, so that makes sense. At the same time, though, in the very same section of his, this was in the commentary on Aristotle's book on the heavens, he then goes on and says the universe itself and all the heavens are the creation of the first cause. So it's not that he didn't believe in God, it's just that he didn't want God to be part of natural philosophy, but as a presupposition rather than a theory. In other words, what he didn't like was micro design. So if we accept such a macro design conception based on this neo-Thomistic model, we realize that this was the standard view both during the late Middle Ages and during early modern science, when the sciences were developing after the Renaissance. The creator is responsible for the existence and order of the universe as an ultimate cause, as a kind of presupposition. This gives us reason to believe in things like the laws of nature, mathematical structure, why is there matter and energy at all in the first place rather than just nothing. And the sciences as, the sciences, or natural philosophy, then study created causes. That's their job. And they do so according to the principles that they're studying. So if they're studying nature, they use natural causes. If they're studying humans, they use humanistic causes. So the social sciences have a humanistic focus. The natural sciences have a naturalistic focus. But neither one of them excludes God. On the contrary, God's a presupposition. And that's why it's called a macro design. There's a designer, but it's of the whole system. And I happen to think that Galileo is an example of that myself. He was certainly a Catholic astronomer. He was very interested in interpreting the Bible in a way that was fitting with the best science, which, by the way, for Galileo always meant whatever he thought was right. And he's famous for saying things like Holy Scripture and nature proceed alike from the divine word. That is, nature is structured by the Logos, by the divine word, just as much as the Holy Scriptures come from the Word of God. And Galileo also argued, as did Copernicus before him, that God is the creator, is a mathematician. God's a mathematician. So I think Galileo adopted this scientific macro design theory, and many of the early scientists did who developed modern natural science. I think I'm going to take a very quick run through intelligent design. I think you may have heard about it. If you want to talk about it more during the break, I can explain more about it. But it is a popular, and I will say it is an anti-Darwinian movement that arose around the year 1990. So it's very new, and I don't think it should be confused with so-called scientific creationism for a couple of reasons. Typically, scientific creationism, as I understand, has been Bible-based, very explicitly based on Genesis. And the designer in intelligent design theory, the careful ones, the scholars, they don't say who the designer is, so it's not based specifically on appeal to God. The other thing is we already do use intelligent design in the sciences, in the social sciences. In economic theory appeals to the way the consumer is going to act, and it's understood that that is going to be an intelligent act. So it's an appeal to the action of an intelligent agent. Sociology, psychology, archaeology, these all look at the evidence we have of human agency, human intelligent action, human design or purpose. The big debate is about inserting this into biology, that is moving from a humanistic focus, which people are going to accept because the social sciences have a humanistic focus, into a natural science which has a natural focus on natural explanations, natural phenomena. And the promise was in the 1990s that intelligent design is going to revolutionize science. I don't think that's happened. I mean, it's been roughly 17, 18 years, and frankly, I have not been impressed with the results of the intelligent design work, such as it has been. It seems to me that ID theory is, in fact, a combination of micro design and macro design. They're not going to deny what I'm trying to say about macro design and the scientific world. But what I want to argue with Jean Verdun and others that we don't want to insert God and God's actions into our theories and explanations in natural philosophy. That turns natural philosophy into theology. It messes up the differences between the disciplines. But this is what they've been trying to do, is insert, okay, they don't say God, an intelligent designer of life into biological theory, where normally you just talk about natural phenomena, natural explanations. Now the basics of idea, probably, there's Behe and Dembski, a couple of the major theorists. It's a quest for empirical evidence for intelligent design, again, specifically in the natural sciences. Dembski has an explanatory filter. Every event, philosophically, must be caused by chance, necessity, or design. If you can eliminate chance and necessity, that's going to leave design. So he thinks that if you're looking at micro machines within a cell, and you can't explain it by chance, it's too complex, too specific, too irreducibly complex. You can't explain it by necessity. It's not the result of pure necessitarian laws. It has to have been designed. I think, though, a macro design approach to the sciences, placing the action of God as a presupposition rather than saying it's actual science, agreeing that it's philosophy. This answers the problem of Dembski without assuming a micro-design approach to biological theory, where you appeal to an intelligent design as an explanation for a particular molecule or for a particular system. The system as a whole is designed. The physics, the chemistry, the biology, all of it is designed. And so particular products of the system may appear to be specifically designed without actually being specifically designed. So if you think there's design already in the whole system of the universe, you're not going to be surprised when you find, let's say, there's design in chemical bonds of molecules. You can say, oh, well, that's because there's structure and order in the whole universe. I think that's probably the best answer to finding some of these amazingly complex molecular machines in cellular biology as well. The whole universe has been designed. Life is something that's somehow built into the whole process of the universe. And so it may look like it's been specifically designed, whereas in fact, rather, it's the system that produced it that has the design in it. That's a macro design approach. So why not then, instead of intelligent design, why not go back to the Middle Ages and adopt a macro design approach? After all, macro design was the original context for science. Macro design approach as a philosophy, recognizing it's a philosophy, we're not pretending it's a science, right? But we're saying it's part of a scientific worldview. It explains the origin and deep structure of the universe, including various anthropic coincidences, the laws of life, the principles and laws of nature. It explains other larger metaphysical questions like why is there something rather than nothing. But what I think is most important is a macro design approach respects the explanatory focus of biology. That is, it respects the historical, socially conditioned, humanly constructed tradition of inquiry of the natural sciences, including biology, that limits their focus to natural phenomena, natural explanations, natural causes. I think that science has made some fairly decent progress in the last couple of hundred years, focusing in the way that it has on nature according to natural phenomena. And it might be a mistake then to undo that without good reason. I haven't seen what the good reason is yet. So I'm going to give an empirically falsifiable prediction, which is in 75 years, we will have so much better understanding of what's going on in the cell that the whole intelligent design movement will be unnecessary. That we will have discovered natural causes for many of these phenomena. In fact, it may well be that even since the publication of Behe's original book, Darwin's Black Box, what I've read on the literature suggests that some of the things he thought were irreducibly complex have been given pretty good natural explanations. So I could be wrong though. I'm willing to recognize this as an empirically falsifiable. I'll be dead, but still, it's falsifiable in principle. We're just discovering the amazing complexity of the cell. Microbiology is a very new science in the history of science. So, the macro design respects the explanatory focus of biology and recognizes that adding a micro design hypothesis goes beyond natural science into philosophy and theology. So we're not pretending that a macro design approach is science. We're saying it's a presupposition, a theistic presupposition that can help fund science without being science itself. Now there is I think one important critique that would push back against me from some of the people I know in the intelligent design movement or that are sympathetic to it. Most of these people are philosophers. And typically analytic philosophers like to say, well, what if this theory were true? Let's follow this line of argument and see if we can make cogent sense out of it. Even if they don't believe it. They're just exploring it to see what are the logical implications. So some of the proponents want scientists to follow the evidence, to aim at the truth. And who cares what discipline it is? You know, if you have to bring in philosophy or theology, so what? You know, why respect these purely socially constructed disciplinary boundaries? Well, I think that's okay for individuals. I mean, the individual scholar ought to discover the truth and follow it wherever it leads them, but they have to recognize it may lead you outside your scientific expertise. An example of this would be a detective, right, who's very good psychological detective, someone like Hercule Poirot, but gets involved in a case where he needs criminological insight from forensic medicine, totally outside his expertise, doesn't know anything about it. So you get involved other experts, you do interdisciplinary work. So I'm just saying that if the scientist as an individual follows the evidence wherever it leads, it may lead them away from natural science and into other disciplines. So following the evidence wherever it leads is not the same thing as disciplinary boundaries can be ignored. The disciplines themselves are communities of inquiry with traditions and histories and leading figures. And they can't follow the evidence wherever it goes because they will lose their explanatory focus and their expertise. They won't be able to discover knowledge in the way that they have in the past by focusing narrowly on their tradition. So in physics, they really focus on matter and energy. That is it. And they've discovered a lot of very cool stuff, but of course there's a lot more to the world than matter and energy. But still, they've discovered a lot of very cool stuff by focusing on that. And I think it would be wrong to think that now physics can answer all of our questions because we know so much about matter and energy. So, extraordinary evidence that we may come upon in whatever discipline sometimes calls for interdisciplinary investigation that takes us beyond the natural evidence. For example, I'll go back to this. What if we had strong evidence of extraterrestrial intelligent life? You can be sure that they wouldn't be able to keep that just in the astronomy department. pretty quickly you'd have xenobiologists, xenoanthropologists, xenolinguists, all kinds of disciplines trying to study whatever evidence that there was, whatever signals that we had. So extraordinary evidence can cause us to go beyond the disciplines, but without changing. That doesn't change the discipline of astronomy. That doesn't change the explanatory focus and the expertise of astronomy. And I think to say, well, what if we discovered this amazing evidence that required intelligent design? Well, we would have to go beyond and do philosophy and do theology, maybe get involved in chemistry and physics and all sorts of things. It would just take you outside of biology. So I still don't think you can insert microdesign into biology and keep biology. Oh. Well, I got some concluding reflections and then some implications for religion and evolution. And then we can open it up for discussion. If I'm right, a macro design approach, which is a philosophical religious assumption, within a scientific worldview, helps to bridge science and religion. It can serve as a sort of metaphysical bridge. We can rebuild the matrix, to coin a phrase, between science and religion. It is clearly a philosophical cum religious approach. It's not pretending to be science. And this, I think, is actually improvement over my friends in the intelligent design movement. It intellectually funds and supports the scientific enterprise by saying, you know, yes, the world is rational. Yes, mathematics has good reason to work. Yes, there's reason to believe that things we've discovered in the past will continue to be true in the future. And just as a matter of pure contingent history, maybe it's not all that important in and of itself, but this perspective did provide the historical context for the rise of the natural sciences in Europe in the early modern period. So I think it's the best approach. And then, of course, you'd want to bring in these other models. I'm not dismissing them. To go back to top-down causation, bottom-up causation, I accept those, but I would see those as pieces of a larger macro design approach within the scientific worldview. Well, how about evolution then? Let's get back to that. What if we adopt a macro design understanding that's basically theistic, sees God as the creator and sustainer, accepts that, you know, depending on your religious point of view, you're going to understand God to have acted in unique ways, but biology is a regulative process of organized development, the design and structure of which has always been there. It just happened that, you know, our Goldilocks planet was in just the right place for all these things to come together. But there was no miracle involved in the origin of life on planet Earth. Well, one of the things is that I think we're going to end up believing, and again, these are suggestions, things I'm thinking about, not absolute conclusions, is that God seems to have created and sustained an open textured universe. This implies a denial of determinism, not only physical determinism, but also any theological determinism, which suggests that everything has all been planned in advance according to the divine decrees. Another thing I think is interesting is God's not really in a big hurry. I mean, you talked about the 13.7 billion years. That's a long time for us as creatures. Obviously, if you're an eternal God, any amount of time is equally short. But God doesn't seem to be in a hurry in terms of God's plan and purpose for the universe. It also seems to me that God has a larger purpose that's not clear to us directly from the natural world. In other words, this is a statement really against both deism and a kind of simple natural theology. At the same time, I would want to say that some indications are there that a God and the cosmos seems to be directed toward openness, diversity, and complexity. I would think it reasonable to believe that God values these things. Maybe I'm wrong, but in other words, God, the creator, appears to value the sort of openness, diversity, complexity, lack of determinism in the system. You might say that God creates a world that is an other to God. that doesn't just work out a predetermined system in the divine mind, but that creates itself to a certain degree, that has a limited autonomy, that may be appropriate to saying that God makes created causes. God doesn't cause everything, except in a sense of being the primary cause. But God creates created causes who then create the universe with God. I don't know, maybe you think that's nuts. But the other thing is, if we're going to believe this about God, then it seems that we are bound to think that death and life are interconnected. Whatever theory of evolution we end up accepting, it seems that death is an integral part of the development of life, at least on our planet, as far as we can tell, so that death is inextricably bound up with life. It may not be an absolute evil, and that suffering is inextricably bound up with joy. That joy and suffering come together in some deep way that I don't think we understand. And that this too may be part of the fact that God has created in the universe and other to God's self that has a limited degree of its own autonomy, although created for a greater purpose. And I would say as a Christian that that greater purpose is to have a relationship with God that is in which the universe has its own integrity as creature. It is not merely a direct expression of who God is. God doesn't create just a mirror of who God is, but a creation that has its own integrity as creature. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. Thank you. So, just before we launch into questions, I just wanted to pick up one little detail which was right near the beginning, and I might end up defending Richard Dawkins slightly here, but which I don't do all the time. So I will,
not all the time.
Not all the time. But just on the point of Dawkins, I think you were comparing him with Stephen Jay Gould in that whole discussion, and suggested that Dawkins was sort of took the position of someone who believed in the evolutionary process as a process of chance with a bit of a big C. I think, to be fair on Dawkins, I've read a couple of places where he comes out quite clearly that actually he views the evolutionary process as one which is not a chance process. And actually, it's in the preface to The Blind Watchmaker, where he says one of the reasons for writing this book is to demonstrate that evolution is not a chance process. So I think I just wanted to flag up in defense of Dawkins there, that I think he would see himself. Now, as far as chance with the sort of big C, ultimate, obviously he doesn't believe in a kind of metaphysical purpose for the universe or all of those kind of things.
Isn't that the reason for the title, The Blind Watchmaker?
Exactly, yeah. So there's a metaphysical story there and message clearly. But as far as the whole evolutionary process, I think he would see that as a very tightly controlled process, which is definitely not a chance process in the sort of communal. Right. There are two different uses of the word chance there.
It's a slippery word, isn't it?
Slippery word, I think, yeah. And I just wanted to kind of flag that up.
And then on the other, in that continuum, if you had Gould on one end and Dawkins sort of in the middle, wouldn't you think on this side you've got Conway Morris, who really sees a definite purpose and structure, so that even if you ran the tape of evolution again, you get animals kind of like the whale. You might not end up being whales, but there would be the ecological niches and the structures of evolutionary laws would end up having animals something like this.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, I think Morris and Gould in that respect would be the opposite ends of the pole in that sense. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Good. Yes. Yeah.
I didn't understand, or I don't agree with your explanation on the Densky's explanatory filter.
Okay.
That it
just every event is either explained by law, chance, or design.
This is okay.
That's it.
I don't see how the macro design could account for the last alternative. I see the macro design as I have understood it as chance and necessity, which has been laid down there. So they are created in the macro design.
No, the design there too is in the system, but it's there all along. And as new phenomena develop in the universe, new laws come into being which structure new levels of reality. So there may, the laws of biology, there aren't many laws, but you know, they didn't apply until there were living things.
Okay, so you would say that
The laws of chemicals didn't apply until there were molecules.
okay, so you would say that the macro design could include a law which would create this very complex thing,
Right.
which is not supposed to be there according to the laws that we know from the sort of
Right.
atomistic part or from the stochastic.
Right.
Okay,
So my point is that you could create a system in which elements look like they've been specifically designed, but in fact they're just the result of the whole system working according to plan. So you still have design. You
It's
still
a
have
special law
design.
that we haven't seen before, which appears now for this specific
Yes.
complex entity. Then I
That implies that laws and principles of nature may change over time, which that's a controversial discussion. I'm not sure I'm
We
ready
might
to
come
go
back
there.
to that one.
Yeah, you might come back to that.
If we have any time. Yes, over here, and then we'll come over here. Yes.
Just back to Dembski's explanatory filter. I've seen it a lot.
Yeah.
You mentioned the three things: chance and law, and then design.
Right.
It always seems so vaguely presented when they say design, because I could see a law as being designed. You know, just take the first two, chance and law. You can have laws designed, and that's kind of an ID thing. Maybe it's more macro, but they throw in that thing, the third thing, design.
Right.
Are they? So, what's the mechanism they posit for it? Is it like
See,
a special act of creation? Is it?
They posit no mechanism.
Right.
Design is meant to be empirically detectable, based on, broadly speaking, Dembski's a mathematician and a specialist in probability theory. So he talks about specified complex information as an empirical sign that something has been designed. And you know that through information theory, right? And so you can't, because that's all you got, you can't specify the mechanism. You have no idea what the mechanism was. You just know that something this specific and this complex that embeds this much information has to have been designed. It can't have come about through necessities, right? Because there, the information, you get the same thing over and over and over again when you've got a necessity, right? And it can't just be random chance, so it has to be designed.
Is it fair to characterize it as a science? Because isn't Dembski a philosopher, and he's saying,
Yeah.
so you just have this filter, this criteria that says, well, this is designed or it's not, and if it is that kind of a natural philosophical thing as to what
I'll give you the same example they always give. It seems a good one to me. You're an archaeologist and you come up on this rock and you're saying, well, this is just another interesting rock, we'll categorize it. And then you have a colleague, though, who looks at it in a new way and says, you know, this just isn't any rock. I mean, look at the design of this rock. Look at the way it's been shaped. I mean, we're looking at a weapon here that some early human created, Neolithic human created. Well, what's the evidence for that? And does that mean archaeology is not a science because they can't specify maybe the exact method that the person used? Just the shape itself suggests that it was a weapon.
I would call that comparing, as a biologist now, speaking of biologists, I call that comparing apples and oranges, in the sense that, you know, it simply, I don't think, and I've read that many times
Yes.
in the sort of literature of the ID movement, but I would see that as simply not a very relevant kind of analogy, you know, the one they use that you quoted, to use, for example, in investigating a complex entity like the cell or the bacterial flagellum or whatever it might be. In other words, there is a program of research there that's been very successful. When you said 75 years, I thought that was a little long to put your prediction in terms of, you know...
It might be 10 years.
Well, you know, I mean, a lot of it is coming through already. So in other words, you have a successful research program that's actually doing a good job in helping us to understand how things work and their origins and their sort of evolutionary trajectory through time. So therefore, when you're on a a successful research program, you tend to keep going on that.
That's right. Why change
And why change it? You know, when,
It's going
when
well.
it's being successful, you know, you don't need all this other stuff to actually help you do
I
that
agree.
program.
I
Therefore,
agree
you
with
keep going on the program that you have. If you really come to a halt in the program, then you might want to think about other things.
I would just like to come back about one
Yes,
thing,
okay,
Dennis, which
yeah.
is that I believe your comment was, why would it be scientific, not why would it be biological. So I think it could count as scientific without knowing the mechanism.
Why are you classifying as a science? It seems to me to be a philosophical criteria. You know, this idea of specified complexity, let's say applied to the DNA, you know, you can still go back to macro design on it, but
The point is that arguing about whether something is designed or not can be science, not that it always is science. And I wasn't trying to say that it's biology, by the way, 'cause I agree with you, it's not very good biology, but it could be scientific. But that's because my sense of science includes the social sciences.
I think, okay, we'll work over this way. We'll get to yes, okay.
I don't think it makes for very good biology.
Right, this is another one about Dembski's filter. Just a quick, hopefully the last one, I guess, but just a quick
You never know.
clarification.
It's an open universe.
Yeah, we've got our three possible causes. We've got chance, necessity, and design. It seems like a survival advantage would be very important too. Would that fall into one of those three categories there? I mean, it's
That
very
would be
similar.
necessity.
It's very similar to necessity, but
It is.
it's not always I mean, I'm thinking, you know, like if you take a multivitamin every day, for example, it can help you to survive, but it's not an essential thing. So that would still be considered in that category.
Well, I don't know about your example, but let's...
What was the example? Because I didn't get
Taking
Take
a
a
multivitamin
every day, it can help
Oh, mine-
improve your health,
sorry.
but it's not
Yeah.
essential for survival.
Right. And so you couldn't predict whether or not, if everyone in your species took that, it would help them survive or not. You couldn't predict that. Right. But the point is that much of evolution is predictable and law-based. Not the mutation, right, but that whether the mutation itself will be helpful or injurious to an organism in a particular environment, you can, in theory, know that in advance. So it's usually not something just like taking a vitamin. It's usually something much bigger, a large genetic mutation, and whether that helps the species survive and populate and propagate and all that.
But that's been included in there. Okay.
Yeah, that I think would reasonably fall under the law. Any biologists?
Yes.
Coming away from the controversial filter for a moment, on bottom-up causation,
Yes.
basically I'm asking why is it not enough, given the huge range of possibilities given within quantum mechanics and the fact that virtually anything can happen just at rather extraordinary probabilities. Why is simple bottom-up causation not enough?
This is an interesting point, and it has to do with the move from the particle physics to what we believe to be possible and impossible for the sort of medium-sized grocery-type objects in our world. And the point that Polkinghorne tends to make is he's really interested in chaotic systems, the dynamics of physical systems, because of the small fluctuations there that result in large differences, differences in outcome. Quantum mechanical theory might say that it's, you know, that chair could float in the air and levitate for 1 minute and come down, but that just shows the limitations of thinking about the physical world only in terms of quantum mechanics. And I think once you bring in other aspects of physics and chemistry, and then you begin to see that's not really possible. It's only possible if you think the quantum theory tells us all we need to know about matter and energy. I don't think that's true. So I think all we're doing when we say that that might be possible is, according to quantum theory, is we're pointing to the limitations of quantum theory. And so I'll use an example, the one I used before, a dead body that's been dead for 3 days. It's physically impossible for that to come back to life. Now, you might say, well, that's very, 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 very improbable. But in the world of medicine, those things are almost identical. You know? So a medical doctor is going to say, okay, fine, it still ends up being impossible. just because it's very, 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 very improbable.
Okay, I think Lydia and then we're coming back over there again, yes.
Yeah, perhaps I could just comment, not my question, but just comment on the bottom-up causality. I think it doesn't work physically. I don't think that Polkinghorne accepts the quantum indeterminacy as applies for God's action, and I think there are reasons why you shouldn't do it. So Bell inequalities, you can't. These are really
Those are
indeterminate,
fixed. Yeah, I agree.
processes. And Kerr's theory is typically deterministic, so there's no place either.
But not with respect to initial conditions. This is once the initial conditions have been set.
Yeah, but once they're set.
Right, but they can be, they're so fine-tuned, right, that God could act on those initial conditions in a way that would be undetectable and would not violate any of the laws of physics.
Would be
I think that's-
undetectable, it would still violate, I think.
Well, see, this gets back to violate. I don't even like the word violate laws of nature. I think the whole way of talking is a mistake.
Okay, coming back to my question, it's about macro design. I wonder if the objection you had to some of the other views doesn't apply to your own view,
Go ahead.
because it doesn't give you the special, the specific
Special
divine actions.
No, it allows for it, though.
So how,
It doesn't tell you what they are, because that to know that, you have to be part of a particular religion. So Muslims are going to have different special divine acts than Christians.
but the mechanism would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Oh,
And
divine
could we have-
omnipotence.
Okay.
In other words, in the Thomistic view, some acts God does purely by divine omnipotence, not by working with created causes. So it explains them. It's just God's pure omnipotent power is the only explanation. There's no mediated causes. In other words, there's no created causes at work, but God working directly on the universe. That's the mechanism. Now, how does that work? No idea. No idea how that works.
I think, you would put the resurrection in that category,
Yes.
for example.
And
Yeah,
creation out of nothing in the beginning
Yes.
of time.
Right.
Those are correct.
Okay, I think we were going to go there and then we'll come back to you.
And actually, her question and the answer were pretty much what I
Oh,
wanted
okay.
to say, get a response to, is that I think people get in love with the term indeterminacy. And of course, in a quantum mechanical system, the level at which things are indeterminate is very, very small. And just because you have that term doesn't mean that all things are possible. And then also, what you commented about chaotic systems, is those are deterministic systems. And you talked about fluctuations, but it's a lack of knowledge of what the initial conditions were. But the system itself is determined.
The system itself isn't determined in the theory, in the model, that is, of physics, but obviously in the real world. It's not quite so determined because if there are indeterminacies in the real world, you just can't specify those initial conditions to the same mathematical precision we can in our mathematical models, which are abstractions from reality. Which is
Just
we
one
would
additional comment is that chaotic systems too are bounded. And again, just because you have this indeterminacy in terms of the initial conditions doesn't mean that all things are possible.
Right. I agree with you. I'm just saying that what I want to say. God may sometimes act in bottom-up ways. I don't want to rule that out as a possibility. I just don't think it gets you very much, I guess.
Yes, we had a question here.
It would say intelligent design focusing on the micro design.
That's what I think.
Well, the intelligent design actually just look at the patterns and well, it looks like it's designed.
Right.
Didn't say what is the mechanism leading
No,
to them. Never
doesn't.
say that. So why can we say, yeah, it is designed through nature, but the nature has to change so that it can come to this pattern. Right.
Yeah, they don't like design through nature, right? They want design to be intelligent design.
Well, the
And
nature
by
can be
definition, natural causes are not intelligent. So the problem there has to do with the word intelligent design and the fact that they're looking at a specific thing and saying this specific thing was intelligently designed as a specific thing.
Well, we
So-
know in the Earth's history, about 4.5 billion years in Earth's
Take a
history,
few.
the environment has been changed a lot from the
Oh,
early
yes.
Earth
Right.
to now what we inhabit. So that process itself, to me, looks like a miracle. And looks like it's a design.
So you think God specifically acted in special ways to alter the atmosphere of the
It's
Earth?
not altered, it's designed.
Well, but design requires alteration. You can't design something and bring it about in the physical world without altering things.
Well,
It's
when
not
we say
possible.
altering, it's not necessarily altering the natural law.
No, I don't mean natural law. I just mean altering
Could be
something
timing.
in nature.
Just like Russell Humphrey, his explanation of a miracle is timing.
Yeah.
At right kind of timing, and God can
we'll
use
the
a natural
word
cause.
Miracle again.
And the
Could we
cause of
not
miracle.
use the word miracle, and you could ask me the question again?
So nature, God can use a nature to navigate a path,
Oh, sure, I agree with
so
that.
that eventually it will lead to
God's
the
purpose.
final design.
Right.
Right.
Sure, no problem with that. Maybe that's the Exodus is like that. I don't know enough about it, but some people have thought that, there's a strong east wind and tidal forces.
Yeah, I like it.
So it was more a coincidence of timing than
Well, I think this is what
absolute miracle.
was being referred to. There's a book by Colin Humphreys, which I imagine is on our bookstall. Becky's nodding.
That's a
It's
good
about
sign.
that whole area. Yeah, so
Right?
indeed, yes. God working through the processes of
Right.
nature to bring about
And that can-
particular events which are
Yes.
in answer to prayer of the people at that
Now,
particular time.
I'm comfortable with
That's a
saying
kind of-
that's
yes.
a miracle. Other
Uh-huh.
people would say it's not, doesn't really count. So I hear you there. I agree with that.
Yes.
Could you expand on what you were saying about continuing creation? I'd like to know why you feel you need to postulate that, what the evidence for it is, and doesn't that go against the first law of thermodynamics? Not that I'm a physicist.
Let's see. It doesn't go against the first law of thermodynamics.
Just, were you saying with continuing creation? I thought I heard
The
you
first
say
law is
God
basically a
putting
symmetry
energy
law
into the
about our equations, right?
It's conservation.
It's a conservation of energy, which is you interpret that mathematically as a symmetry law.
Right.
But I'm not talking about energy as we know it in physics, when I'm talking about God's omnipotence. So God's omnipotence does not violate any symmetry laws in physics or chemistry.
But you are saying God put energy in, is continuing to put energy into the universe.
Divine energy, right. That's right. But that would imply that although in physics and chemistry and astronomy we assume the universe is a closed system, and it is
Yeah.
for the purposes of natural law, because we're studying created matter and energy, not omnipotence, right? It may still nevertheless be the case that God does things that can neither be predicted nor governed by natural law.
So why
It
do
wouldn't
you
violate
need-
the first law of thermodynamics.
Fine. Why do you need to postulate that God is continuing to put energy into the universe, apart from sustaining the laws that He's given us? Why does God
And continuing
continue to?
being the things that exist.
No, maybe.
But
Continuing
why?
in
Well,
being.
why? I think the answer is, the question is...
It's a metaphysical point. Do you think?
Yes, why do you think that is the case? I think
Oh,
is
it
what-
has.
what is the
It's
case?
a complex
Yes.
metaphysical argument. I think having to do with what does it mean to be? What is the source of being? And do things exist of themselves or not? And the simplest hypothesis is there's one infinite being that exists of itself, of itself, of herself. That's the creator and sustainer of all other contingent things, none of which can exist of themselves, and therefore always require a creator. Not just in the beginning, but now. Because they're contingent, finite, incapable of existing forever, or of themselves.
So that's a theological concept. Is there
It's a
any
metaphysical
evidence
concept.
in day-to-day life?
I'm sorry?
Is there any evidence of that in our experience?
No.
Well, I think, wouldn't you say, if that wasn't the case, there wouldn't be a universe, that
Oh yeah.
there wouldn't exist. So the evidence would be there was nothing there to talk about. We wouldn't be here.
That's right.
If what you're
So we
saying-
couldn't have any day-to-day experience.
Isn't that more the point? Yeah. In other words,
Well, yeah.
if that continuing creation wasn't there wouldn't be anything to talk about
Nothing to
because we
talk
wouldn't
about.
exist. So
We
therefore,
wouldn't exist.
it's operating at that level. Whereas I
Right.
think you're more interested in the, if you
Sort
like,
of the
scientific
empirical.
level, the empirical level
Yeah.
down here, as it were. I think,
Yeah.
if I understand the conversation.
No,
it's
yeah, that's a good
yeah.
point. Yes.
I don't think I'd want God to test that one.
Yeah, and that might hurt.
Oh, we did collapse into nothingness.
It would
Yes.
not be a good thing.
I have a friend who's trying to make a black hole in a laboratory, and
Uh-oh.
the joke is, the whole universe will fall into it, or when it comes. It's a very, very small black hole, so it's not a danger. But
Let's hope it's a very small.
so that's the idea.
I'm sure he exaggerates the size when he's asking for grants,
As
though.
long as he gets the paper, he won't mind.
I won't disappear.
Okay, so what moving on? Yes, back to Lily again. Yes.
Coming back to ID, so I see the biological argument that you don't want ID as long as you have a good scientific research program. But when you're on the theological side, so if you believe in specific divine action for, say, the Exodus or resurrection or some of these kinds of events, then I think I would expect as well, especially divine action for the origin of life or for the origin of the human being, at least in the theological sense.
It's possible. I'm not ruling it out as utterly impossible. I'm just saying that as a philosophy of science, I find it unacceptable. But I think you're right. On the theology side, there's no reason you might not expect it if you were just doing theology. What do you think about that, Dr. Yeager?
Yeah, this would give us a very view, but
So it really has to do with what do we mean by natural science, right? And the explanatory focus of the natural sciences being on natural things, natural phenomena, natural problems, rather than a theological point.
Going back to sustaining for a minute, Wolfhard Pannenberg's thought that when we got the law of inertia with Newton, that kind of did away with the need for sustaining, God sustaining insofar as everything continues in its state of rest or motion without needing anything doing to it. But maybe things change there with more modern science, where there's much more contingency involved.
I've always thought that Pannenberg made a mistake on that.
About inertia?
Yeah, he is. I mean, all you're saying is inertia is part of the nature of things. That things continue on with the energy and direction that they had already. It doesn't really undermine the much more broad metaphysical point about where does being come from, why is there something rather than nothing, and so forth. So it doesn't answer the question, where do these natures come from, including the inertia that's part of the natures.
Yeah.
So I think he just, he may be right historically in terms of the history of thought or something like that, but I think as a...
Yeah, because didn't we move from the idea, we don't need a prime mover anymore, because,
Right. So he's right historically, but
maybe
as a
we need
matter
prime-
of fact...
Maybe we need a prime changer, though, because it's acceleration, it's the change of motion that needs,
Explaining.
explaining.
I think part of this discussion about the sustaining and upholding of creation isn't part of the problem that it can be presented in a very sort of passive way. And, you've got this sort of changeless, almost in a deistic way. God is just sort of sustaining it, on the side, in this very kind
That's
of
where you
passive
get
way.
this intervention metaphor that's so
Yes,
terrible.
I think but I think when you have a dynamic universe, it's a changing dynamic universe, and we're all changing, and our bodies are changing, and our genes have changed since we sat here, and all that, going on all the time. So therefore, it's a very dynamic system, isn't it? I think when we have that idea of a dynamic continuing creation, then you have a bit of a different picture, I think. For me, anyway.
Well, I think
I think
that's what Pannenberg was saying too, because that's a more modern perspective. on
Yes,
things
that's
as well.
well. I think even the Newtonian view required it myself. That's just my view. And I would say that this presses then the question of why is it, since the universe is dynamic and changing, why is it that it is structured and ordered over time? Since the structure and order, at least at the quantum mechanical level, creates the matter and the energy in the first place. And that's when you get back to this thing about, well, there must be a principle of order and structure that's not matter that allows it to continue over time, that otherwise it wouldn't have.
Yes.
I have a sort of general comment. My impression of this is that we're seeking combinations or extensions of ordinary science to allow for divine intervention or allow for God in there. And I see a sort of important in between there, which we haven't touched upon at all yet, which is the concept of human interaction or free will. Because this is also something that violates current physical laws. There is no opening there for free will. We don't have it in the equations. And I would say that to understand that and to understand what has a free will and how does that interact is a very important stepping stone towards having a theory or a description which describes what we haven't talked about.
Well, you've got 8 minutes to solve the problem of free will.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. I think that physical determinism, all the way back to the Newtonian worldview, not Newton himself, the French Revolution, has always been a mistake. That the abstraction, that the laws of physics, the fundamental laws of physics, have always been abstractions. They've never perfectly described the physical world, and that the whole idea of the Laplacian demon, who knows so much that he, for some reason, demons are always he. Have you noticed that? God may be a she, but demons are always going to be he. That the demon could retrodict and predict the whole history of the universe. That whole world picture, I think, has always been false. John Ehrman has a brilliant book, Primer on Determinism, where he argues rigorously mathematically that even on Newtonian classical mechanics, the universe is not perfectly determined. So the first thing I would say is there may be no room for free will in the laws. That's a problem with the laws, not with free will. Now, I love physics. The physical laws are great. They tell us all kinds of wonderful things, like when the sun will come up tomorrow, and there's many determined systems in the universe. But I don't think we can say from that the whole of the universe is fully physically determined by any fundamental laws of nature or principles of nature. So I think, on the contrary, that the world has indeterminacy, openness, and freedom built into it, just so that creatures with some kind of free will might long evolve.
And I agree with that.
Okay, good.
So are you open theist?
What is that? Well, let's go back to Halber and then we'll come back.
So I agree with that. That the world is open for free will, but our current descriptions of the world using
Yes,
science
got you. All right, now I see. Yes, you're right. You're right.
And we have sort of now discussed how to incorporate God into this, and I said incorporating that free will into our scientific
Would be a big step.
would be a very big step, and maybe a smaller step still than what we have been discussing.
And maybe we can't.
Yes, but
I mean, maybe it's just part of being a natural or social science that you can only describe those things which are not free.
well, I would disagree. I would say that the current multiverse perspective, which is just another interpretation of quantum mechanics, you could say.
Oh, that one.
It's not the Copenhagen interpretation.
Oh, you mean the multiple universe interpretation of quantum
Universe
mechanics?
interpretation. Yes. Where
It makes for a
basically-
very good TV show, I think.
Yes, but I would say that it's probably the most, at least to me, convincing.
Oh, you like
explanation.
that?
Yes, and I would say that this includes the possibility of free will, along with determinism.
Doesn't it eliminate free will, though, really? I would have thought it did.
Well, And well, it depends on what you mean by
Every choice is determined.
that
This is
has to
different
be-
worlds.
Yes,
different
yes,
outcomes.
but it goes back to the question about what has this free will. And I would say that this entity would be a local entity in a single universe that moves not only between universes but also is a local entity. And so this is basically you and I. We're different local entities in a given universe, about to move one step forward in time to a new
It's
universe.
different universes.
Yes, and then there are many universes to go to.
Right.
And in the multiple universe, in the multi-universe perspective,
Yes.
you move to all these universes.
It's really an infinite number of universes.
Yes.
aren't there? Yes.
And this is what happens, and this is what is deterministic. But the free will is that you as a local entity only experience one of these universes. And you can choose which one should I experience.
Now, I like everything except that last sentence. I don't think you can choose which one you're going to experience, and here's why. How many Halbert Kvandals are there in the whole of reality?
What is Albert Gunnar?
You, or I'm sorry, what is your name again? I'm sorry.
Gunnar is it?
Gunnar. Okay, sorry, Gunnar, my mistake. I've got you mixed up with someone else. How many of you are there in the totality of reality?
Well,
And then this is not just a trivial question, and here's the reason why. Most philosophers would say that there can only be one person with the exact identity that that person has. So it turns out that there's one Alan Padgett that chose to come and give these lectures, right? And another Alan Padgett that chose to stay home and play golf instead. And then there's another Alan Padgett that went to China instead. And you see, so for every choice, actually for every indeterminate outcome of a quantum event, there's another universe. Now that doesn't matter when we're talking about the quantum events that make up this controller, right? Because the fact that there's multiple versions of this controller, nobody cares about that. There's true anyway. But when it comes to personal identity over time, we rather like to think that I'm the same person that I was. But you can't really have personal identity across all these universes. There have to be multiple versions of the same person. Each one of those versions is fully determined. That is, in that universe, their choice is totally determined already. You really can't choose which of the future universes you're going to go into. That's already predetermined.
But you're going to all of them. There is a
You-
universe.
There's a sense in which that's true and which it's false, right? Because once you split into 50 different types of you don't exist anymore. Rather, it's all these 50 versions of you that exist. And the choice of this one's choice was determined. It had to be Alan Padgett number 157. Because what makes that Alan Padgett number 157 is he decided to come to Cambridge to give a lecture. So it's part of the very essence of that being made all those choices, and so that being is determined. And there is no Alan Padgett that exists in all these versions. I mean, there's only specific numbers of Alan Padgett. Anyway, it turns out that, as far as I can tell, choices are fully determined. Because the choice is built into the identity of that person at that moment of time.
Yes.
That's what makes him that person, and not the virtually identical person, but made a different choice. So being Alan Padgett number 157 means you have to have chosen to come to Cambridge. Otherwise you'd be Alan Padgett number 151.
Exactly, so you can choose which Alan.
No, you can't choose. It's totally determined in the system. You have no choice.
I think this is a
That's the way I
discussion that
think
could
about it, anyway.
carry on quite a
Pure
bit more.
philosophy, sorry.
I have a feeling that we've worked Alan Padgett number 157 quite well. I'm just thinking there's totally fresh and unused Alan Padgetts in other universes, 156, 155. But since you're 157, I think we should now give you a break, and thank you very much indeed
Thank you
for your
very
hard work.
much.